So perhaps I should say a little bit about my career, just a very quick intro. I'm British, as you may have guessed from my accent. I studied first in England, then in Northern Ireland, did my PhD in Northern Ireland. My PhD thesis was in philosophy. It was called The Political Turn in Animal Ethics. So very much started out moral philosophy, became political philosophy as I was writing it. And I've kind of stayed very much in the moral philosophy, political philosophy world, very much in the applied ethics end of things. After my PhD, I did a year in Canada, where I worked with Will Kimlicker at Queen's University. That was a great experience, and it was there that I was working, that I first worked on my project, Just Fodder, The Ethics of Feeding Animals, and the book was just published last month or the month before. So I'd be very impressed if anyone here has read it, because it's only just out, but that's out, that's in the world, and that's something I'm very happy to talk about. Questions about the feeding of animals. That's not just companion animals, though it certainly includes companion animals, but also wild animals of various kinds, and, you know, the myriad animals who fall somewhere between companion domesticated animals and wild animals. After I finished my postdoc, I moved to University of York in the UK, where I taught in the politics department. I still live in York, if anybody knows UK geography. After that, I moved to University of Sheffield, where I started a second postdoc, working with Alistair Cochrane, who some of you may know as the author of Animal Rights Without Liberation, Sentience, Politics, and a few other books in animal rights. Again, very much on the political end of things. And then very recently, I just started a lectureship, or what would be known in the States as an assistant professorship, at Loughborough University in the UK, which is highly regarded university without big international name recognition, because Loughborough itself is a very small town, but the university is very, very well known for its sport, of all things, though I can't say I'm particularly sporty myself. So as I mentioned, I published this book, Just Fodder, The Ethics of Feeding Animals. I've also just submitted, a few months ago submitted to Oxford University Press, the completed manuscript of my second book, which is called Food, Justice and Animals, Feeding the World Respectfully. And this is a book about future food systems, and in a sentence it says, what would a future food system look like in a zoopolis, in a rights-respecting state? And my answer is, surprisingly, it would not be a vegan food system. I argue that we can have our cow and eat her too. I argue that we can have a system that respects animal rights while we can still have access to animal-based foods, because there is a gap between animal rights and veganism insofar as there are ways to source animal-sourced foods that are respectful of animal rights. And I know that some people know the kind of thing I'm talking about here, because I've published a few articles about them. For example, cultivated meat and cellular agriculture, that kind of thing. So that's forthcoming. Keep your eyes open for that. The only other thing I will mention before we jump into the Q&A is that I host a regular animal studies podcast called Knowing Animals. It was previously hosted by Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I've taken it over now that Siobhan has sadly had to step down due to ill health. And this interviews animal studies scholars, including philosophers, political scientists, lawyers, but also people more in other areas of the humanities, historians, geographers, literature scholars, etc., about recently published work in animal studies. So it's a great way for me to keep up to date with what's been published around the animal studies world, and also to inform people about what's going on there. The last thing I'll say is, feel free to follow me on Twitter or Instagram or on academia.edu if you want to keep up to date with my work. And I'm always happy to chat to people if you want to drop me an email after the Q&A session today. So yeah, happy to answer questions on just about anything, and looking forward to seeing what people have got to say.
Awesome. Well, I guess we can start off with asking a few questions about the ethics of feeding animals. I assume that's fresh on your mind from your book. And so basically, what do you argue there? Do you think we should, or we have a responsibility to feed, say, dogs a vegan diet if they can be very healthy on it?
Yeah, so in a word, yes. I think that there's some interesting ethical questions here. And the reason I say that is that we have an awful lot of academic literature from a wide variety of disciplines, but certainly in moral political philosophy, certainly in the kind of literature I know the best, which look at the ethics of human veganism. But we have next to nothing exploring the ethics of feeding plant-based foods or feeding meat, conversely, to companion animals or to other animals. And this is despite the fact that, number one, this is a practical problem that people really face. Number two, it's a practical problem that people really argue about. I'm sure it's happened on this Discord server, but all you need to do to start a fight between vegans is to join a vegan Facebook group and say the phrase vegan cat food and watch the battle lines be drawn. Now, it strikes me that when those arguments take place, people are appealing to a variety of different arguments about naturalness, about health, about the relative value of naturalness, health, and animal suffering, and so forth. And I thought, well, actually, there needs to be some philosophical analysis here, or philosophers could add something to this. So I started really digging down into it. And in a sentence, while there are very different issues at stake when it comes to companion animals and meat eating, it strikes me that the ultimate conclusion is quite similar. If animals have rights or animal suffering matters considerably, as I hold they do, and it does, we need to be restricting our use of animals as food for humans and for other animals. Now, the big caveat here, as was quite rightly pointed out, is that there might be a health element. There might be a health element that we need to take quite seriously here. And so I accept that it's much easier to feed dogs a plant-based diet than it is to feed cats a plant-based diet. And then we can talk about, ferrets or reptiles or fish or any other animals that we might want to be feeding for whatever reason. And so I think that in addition to championing the development of plant-based pet foods, and to be clear, there are already a lot on the market. I feed my dogs commercially available plant-based complete kibbles and various plant-based treats. In addition to the development of these kinds of products, we need to think seriously about kind of third ways that we could have pet foods that are neither plant-based nor conventionally meat-based. And one thing I'm very excited about, I've already mentioned it, is cultivated meat. And there are a number of companies out there that are racing to produce cultivated meat for the pet food market. Not commercially available yet, but I'd like to imagine that in, say, 10, 15 years, this problem, or the ethical problem here, will be in a large way resolved, or will be by the by, because of the fact that we'll be able to have access to meat-based pet foods that are completely harm-free. Now, some of you might want to challenge the ethics of cultivated meat, and I'm very happy to talk about that, but let's roll with that for now.
All right, fantastic. Well, thanks so much for that thought-provoking answer. So, now, a big topic around here. Many debates have been had regarding freeganism, and your paper has been at the forefront of many of these debates. So, we got some questions. So, I was wondering about your argument against freeganism when it comes to crop deaths. Say someone is convinced that the violation of dignity norms is a reason against consuming freegan products. What if they hold that the crop deaths involved in creating vegan products are a weightier reason, and thus conclude that we should eat freegan products? Secondly to that, do you think that the doctrine of double effect is important when addressing crop deaths? / how big of an issue do you take crop deaths to be? And also, it might be good to start off just sort of explaining your argument in the Freegan paper, just for those who haven't read it.
Yeah, great. I'm sorry if you heard that noise. I was just pulling a notebook so I could scribble down some thoughts. So, the Freeganism paper, this arose from a conversation that Bob Fisher and I had, and I know that Bob Fisher has featured in the past, so I'm sure many of you will know his work. It's very, very good. Bob Fisher and I started chatting about the ethics of freeganism. This partially came in response to a wonderful paper by Donald Bruckner called Strict Vegetarianism is Immoral, about roadkill. Now, before I introduce the paper, let me first say we're using the word freeganism in a very technical, limited sense. When we say freeganism, we mean eating meat that would otherwise go to waste. Okay, so we're not talking about the broader freegan philosophy. That's a very interesting topic, but it's not what we're doing here. Okay, so on the face of it, and indeed when you check the footnotes and you check the kind of caveats that are given in lots of standard cases for veganism and vegetarianism in the philosophical literature, on the face of it, there doesn't seem to be much wrong in eating meat that would otherwise go to waste. And that's because it doesn't seem to contribute in any way to actual harm to animals. standardly, we take it that it's the harm to animals that is the wrong-making feature of meat eating rather than the meat eating itself. So, of course, if we are eating food that would otherwise go to waste, we're not contributing to that harm. So far, so kind of familiar. So then what Bob and I did is we ran through a bunch of different arguments that might or might not work to justify or to support the claim that we should be vegans rather than freegans. Freegans, again, in the technical sense that we're using the term. We found all of them quite wanting. So what we instead did is we developed an alternative argument that we had borrowed from Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker's Zoopolis. Now, they mention this very much in passing in the context of, as it happens, a discussion about the feeding of cats, which is the other topic I was just mentioning that I've worked on. And what they say is, well, maybe members of our community, and they accept that many animals are members of our community, namely domesticated animals are members of our community. By community here, they mean political community. Members of our community are owed respectful treatment of their corpses, whatever respectful treatment means in the particular community in question. So here in the UK, we might think burying or cremating is a respectful way to treat a corpse. We probably don't think butchering and eating is a respectful way to treat a corpse. Now, there are cultures in the world historically and currently which do engage in some corpse eating practices, whether that's human corpse eating or feeding human corpses to wild animals. But these are very much the minority. So what we suggest is that maybe freeganism violates these kinds of norms, which is, I think, what's meant by dignity norms here. Now, I'm actually quite skeptical about the language of dignity generally, but it's a useful shorthand. So if we take these animals, these domesticated animals are owed certain kinds of respectful treatment of their corpses, we might take it that butchering their corpses and then eating them afterwards violates that kind of norm, at least while we live in communities where that kind of treatment would be way beyond the pale for human corpses, which I strongly suspect it is for everybody here in the communities that they're members of. Okay, so that's the kind of long and short of the argument. Now, of course, that leaves an open question of to a certain extent, which animals are members of our community and what kinds of treatment norms are justified in given communities, and those are interesting questions. But the questions that you asked, as I remember, is how we balance that with the harms involved in crop deaths. And I actually think that's exactly the right question to ask. So nobody will have read this because it's not yet publicly available. But I was actually invited to write a chapter about freeganism in the narrow sense that we use the term. And this is for a forthcoming book called New Omnivorism, which is co-edited by Cheryl Abbate and Christopher Bobbier, I'm not sure you pronounce it. Some of you might know these names, two very interesting philosophers from the States. And in that paper, I was asked to defend freeganism, defend the thing that I had previously written a paper criticising. And I was very happy to do that because I take exactly this line. I suggest, look, even if we accept the kinds of quote-unquote dignity arguments that I make in that paper with Bob Fisher, it seems that it's entirely plausible that the very great harms caused to animals through arable agriculture, through running a combine harvester through a field of wheat, for example, this kills a lot of animals who live there or disrupts their lives in very major ways. That kind of harm might outweigh the wrong involved in freegan practices. And what that would mean is that it would be better to eat freegan, even if there's a prima facie wrong in eating freegan, than supporting those industries of arable agriculture which cause harm to animals. So I think that there is a very interesting question about weight here. And we can complicate that interesting question about weight by bringing in that other factor that I was asked about in this question, which is the doctrine of double effect. Now, my position is not a consequentialist position. It's a broadly deontological position. It's a rights-based position. So I certainly do accept something like the doctrine of double effect. The particular name, doctrine of double effect, has an interesting kind of Catholic natural law kind of vibe, which I don't necessarily love. But nonetheless, I certainly accept there's a difference between doing and allowing. I certainly accept that there's a difference between intending and foreseeing. So I think that the doctrine of double effect does make a big difference. And so what that could mean, what that could mean is that it is worse to deliberately violate the quote unquote dignity norms than to foreseeably but unintentionally violate the various duties we may have to field animals, those animals who will be harmed in arable agriculture. So, as a one-line summary, I think this is really hard. I don't think it's actually that easy to come up with a concrete answer to this. I think there's a range of different factors in play, and I think that weighing these factors is quite difficult and might be quite contextual, in the sense that sometimes we might lean one way and sometimes we might lean another, perfectly legitimately. Now, that might sound quite dissatisfying, but I think that that's the nature of doing this kind of applied work. Often, what people like me are doing is we're saying, well, here's another factor that we need to take into consideration. And it may not be that the factor we need to take into consideration is so weighty that it drowns out all the other factors.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for that answer. And then I was wondering, so crop deaths are something I am super bugged about. I think about them a lot of like most days. And yeah, so I was wondering, would you be able to just explain further the intended versus foreseen harms point? I know a lot of people are a little bit confused on that and just what the doctrine of double effect is trying to express. And then if maybe you could put it in the context of why a vegan might say we ought not eat the say free range cow, right, that didn't have as many crop deaths to produce, like say it's like a grazing animal, ignore like land clearing or whatever like that, versus a vegan eating maybe a seitan burger, which had a whole bunch of wheat, potentially killed all the field mice, all the insects, etc.
Yeah, super. So I'm glad that there's a lot of people here, yourself included, who are really worried about this crop death argument, because I find it very worrying. But then I sometimes think, oh, this is just philosophical hand-wringing. So it's great that people outside of, you know, the 5 or 6 scholars who write about this are interested in this question. So doctrine of double effect, I think, is best illustrated through an example of warfare, which is actually something I'm working on at the moment, the ethics of war and how animals fit into that, or if they do.
Oh, right. I saw that on your website. That's really interesting.
Yeah, so I've got one paper out on that and a few others in draft form at the moment, which will hopefully be published at some point soon. I'd like to write a book in a few years about this, but it's, you know, it's such a massive topic. I'm approaching it gradually. Right. I'm throwing myself at the deep end. Anyway, so the warfare example is, in war, civilians die, right? This is basically inevitable. War is a hideous thing that should be avoided at all costs. Well, no, not at all costs. War is a hideous thing that we should do our best to avoid. However, sometimes war is an appropriate response to an awful situation. A very straightforward example is, I don't think that Ukrainians should have just walked away when Russians started crossing their border, right? I think that the violence the Ukrainian army is using against the Russians is the kind of thing that is in principle justifiable. Now, I'm not going to go any further than that, but I think that this is a fairly clear example of the sort of war that is in principle permissible. Anyways, there's a big difference. So civilians die in war, even wars that are justified. But there's a very, very big difference between dropping bombs that we know are probably going to end up killing civilians, because these legitimate military targets that we're aiming at are in areas where civilians are sometimes present, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, shooting a gun at a civilian, right? Because in one case, we are foreseeing civilian deaths, but we recognise this as something deeply regrettable. It's not what we're intending. It is a foreseen yet non-intended and regretted consequence of something that we are legitimately doing. In the other case, we are deliberately targeting. Now, when you start to break down the differences in kind of typical analytical philosophy fashion, you realise that it can be very, very hard to draw the line, if the line can be drawn at all, between deliberately targeting and foreseeably but non-intentionally harming. Nonetheless, there is an intuitive sense, and I'm inclined to think theoretically important sense, in which there's a big difference between these cases. So in our present case, this is the difference between deliberately targeting a cow, that is, bundling a cow into the back of a van, taking the cow to a slaughterhouse, hanging the cow up, cutting the cow's neck, etc. All the other ugly things we do in slaughterhouses. And this is a kind of case of intentional targeting. And the other is the case of running a combine harvester through a field or whatever large machinery in whatever kind of context you can pick out for arable agriculture, knowing that there's going to be some mice, there's going to be some moles, there's going to be some lizards, there's going to be some birds that are there, badly affected, possibly killed by this activity. And we might think that the killing of the cow is all else equal worse because of the direct intentional aspect. If you're a pure utilitarian, pure consequentialist theorist, you might be inclined to say that there's no difference. I'm not that. Okay, so that's your basic doctrine of double effect issue. Could you remind me what the second part of the question was?
I think you might have got all of it. The second part, I think, was just me asking for you to put it in the context that you did.
Okay, so let me just say a couple more things. So you said in relation to the cow versus the the animals in the farm. The animals in the arable farm, the field animals we might call them. I think it's very important to remember that while there's also this tricky philosophical point about intention versus foreseeability and all the rest of it, there's also tricky philosophical points about the nature of the animals being affected, right? So I think that cows have a much stronger interest in continuing to live than do insects, if insects have an interest in continuing to live at all. Controversial issue that we could argue about a great deal. But I think we also need to be quite clear that there's a real numbers game here. And these early papers defending the kind of beefitarian, it's sometimes called, or burger veganism or whatnot, there's all these different names that come out, position from people like Archer, from people like
Davis.
Thank you, Davis. Yes, I should apologise. It's Saturday evening where I am, so I'm not quite at my sharpest.
It's all good.
So yeah, Archer, Davis, their numbers are just way off, right? Their numbers are way off. They make some serious errors in calculation. And the other thing is that we don't actually know how many animals are killed in the field, right? So even aside from their errors in calculation, we just don't have the empirical data available to really make these calculations yet. I think these are calculations that we should be making. We just need to remember that it's not all a numbers game unless it's all a numbers game if you accept a certain kind of crude consequentialism, like a very crude consequentialism. But there are a bunch of other factors at stake that need to be brought into the consideration that Davis and Archer just overlook entirely.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for that one. All right, moving on to the next question. So I asked you this earlier in our private call, but I'll read it out again for everyone. So in our AMA with Tristram McPherson, he responded to some of what you said about dignity norms. I don't like to say respect norms or something else. In the Freegan paper you co-authored with Bob Fisher. In short, he started by saying animals don't seem to be the sort of individuals who care about post-mortem dignity norms. The person asking the question to Tristram then pointed out marginal case humans and how post-mortem dignity norms still apply to them. Tristram then explained that he views dignity norms similar to how he views granting voting rights, whereby there's no real capacity that we identify whereby if an individual has it, dignity norms / voting rights apply. If they don't, they don't. For example, he noted that there are people over the age of 18 with less of a capacity to understand politics than a 14-year-old, yet we still let all 18-year-olds vote, basically regardless of these capacities. Likewise, he thinks that's how we treat post-mortem dignity amongst humans, yet it does not apply to animals. How would you respond to this?
Okay, super. There's a bunch of stuff going on here. So as a first point, we might want to challenge these voting norms. We might want to say that the way we approach voting is mistaken or confused. So, that might undermine the argument to a certain extent. But I'm not going to go into that. And I'm not sure where I stand on that, to be quite clear. I think probably... No, I'll not say because you... Anyway. I'll not say because we're on video, but maybe I'd be more inclined to go vote, offering voting rights to children. Anyway, I just did say. Never mind.
Yeah, you did. Out of the bag.
Never mind. So I think the fact that McPherson is willing to extend this to all humans but not all animals just kind of smacks of speciesism. It just seems to be an arbitrary kind of declaration that we're using that line rather than any other. So I think that's interesting. But I think the other thing I would say is that nothing in mine and Fisher's argument depends upon individuals kind of caring about this. And in fact, we address this quite explicitly when we say that this is an issue of manners, right? It's an issue of recognizing certain norms that predominate in a society. And the nature of those norms is that you kind of can't opt out of them. Or at least we can ask questions about opting out of them. So there are people are open to their body being used for all kinds of grotesque purposes. And in the paper, we cited an example of a music producer who wanted his dead body to be given to a magazine called Girls and Corpses. Yeah. And he said that, I guess this is a pornographic magazine from the name. I honestly don't know. But the point was his corpse could be used in various ways for the purposes of this magazine. I mean, weird, right? Now, we're not necessarily saying that's okay, that's not okay, that's an interesting conversation, but it's not the conversation we're having. All we're doing is we're demonstrating that people are open to their body being used in all kinds of different ways. And lots of people, of course, just don't care, right? Whether because, as you quite rightly point out, they don't kind of have the capacities necessary to understand the nature of, their body being used after their death, or because they just think, well, once I'm dead, what does it matter? Or something similar. But I think that plausibly, norms of corpse respect transcend those kinds of individual considerations. So we suggest, following Donaldson and Kimlicka, that norms of corpse respect might be tied to community membership. And I'm guessing McPherson is playing a similar line, yet the community he's talking about is the quote-unquote human community. Whereas what we're talking about, following Donaldson and Kimlicka, is something more like a political community, right? So actually, norms of corpse respect are owed to all beings within a given community. Norms of corpse respect are owed to all beings, full stop. What those norms of corpse respect mean depend upon community membership. And so what we need to do is we need to look at what community a particular being is in, and we can argue about that. But I think that domesticated animals and human citizens belong to the same kind of community, following Donaldson and Kimlicka. And so they are owed the particular norms of corpse respect that are doled out in that community. And maybe those need to change, right? Maybe we're wrong to treat corpses with such sanctity. Maybe we should be open to this music producer having his body used for the magazine Girls and Corpses. Maybe we should be open to, the eating of corpses after death. But right now, this is way beyond the pale in my community, at the very least, my political community. These are not the kinds of things that people are open to in the slightest. And so I think that we have very good reason to think that insofar as domesticated animals are members of our community, we owe those same kinds of norms of corpse respect to them. Now, of course, this is not an absolute constraint. There are going to be other considerations that may be relevant. As we were saying before, maybe these norms can be outweighed. And of course, I recognise that this is a kind of ideal theoretic consideration. Given that we live well away from the community that I'm envisaging as ideal here, we might be inclined to think that we should take the norms that we would follow in that community with a pinch of salt, right? The fact that XYZ would be a norm in the ideal community does not necessarily translate to the claim that we should be doing that today. But it's at least a consideration when we're deciding what we should be doing today. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's thank you so much. Would you by any chance be able to go into what you mean by political community, and then how in general you determine whether an individual is within or outside of?
Yeah, great. So for the purposes of that paper, I was following Donaldson and Kimlicka, and I don't agree entirely with their framework for a few different reasons, but I think that it's the right kind of direction. So what Donaldson and Kimlicka say, or what they do, is they take existing human communities and they say that, like it or not, some animals have been brought into these communities and so are entitled to the rights of co-membership. And by some animals in question are domesticated animals, not just dogs and cats, but also animals who live on farms and other animals who we have brought into our community, who we relate to in that kind of way. So it doesn't include, for example, captive wild animals. And we can argue about drawing that line. I think that's interesting. So those animals, Donaldson and Kimlick, are entitled to citizenship rights. Some animals, namely wild animals, are entitled to rights to control their own future and their own communities. These animals are entitled to sovereignty. And then in the middle you have what they call liminal animals, who are animals who are not quite domesticated, not quite wild. A paradigm example would be, the birds I feed in my garden, would be raccoons, foxes who live in urban centres. But there's a bunch of different examples out there. The point is, they live near us, with us, without being a part of our community. Now, the simple fact is there aren't hard and fast lines between these groups. So a cat who lives mostly on her own on the streets but sometimes visits a human family, are they a citizen, are they a liminal animal? It's not quite clear. So I think that at the edges this is fuzzy, and that might be problematic. In fact, I think it probably is problematic. But the idea is that this is a way to identify, this is a kind of method, this is a shape of argument that can help us identify which animals are members of our communities. Now, I hasten to point out, and this is something this is a criticism that's been levelled at me and my work as well, is that this is a small c conservative picture insofar as it takes existing human communities mostly for granted, right? And you have slightly more radical political visions of human-animal relationships that say, well, we need to move away from the liberal statist picture, for example, towards a cosmopolitan picture or an anarchist picture or something like that. And I'm very open to those conversations. And I think there's probably going to be another question about that. So I'll pause what I'm saying there and hold it for the later question.
All right. Well, we will ask a question in the similar vein, which is, do you think any particular economic system is more conducive to animal rights? Many anti-capitalist vegans claim that the profit motive within animal agriculture encourages corner cutting, cruel treatment, and things like factory farms. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that atrocious treatment of animals is something that does take place under capitalism, but equally it takes place under socialism, right? Profit motive, yes, it can drive to particularly ruthless forms of exploitation, but capitalist systems, liberal capitalist systems, also have rooms for drawing bright lines and saying this is a rule that you have to follow, this is a line that cannot be crossed. So I don't think that capitalism is inconsistent with animal rights, and in fact I think that the language of rights fits quite neatly into a liberal framework in a way that doesn't necessarily fit into, say, a socialist framework. That wasn't the question. No, the question was, do I think there's any particular economic system which is conducive to animal rights? And the answer is honestly no. I don't think any of them are. Historically, we've not seen animal rights emerge in any economic system. I don't see any reason to believe that any one is particularly conducive rather than any others. If we're interested in rights specifically, I'm inclined to think that we want an economic system where the idea of rights is familiar. And that would be, say, a liberal system or possibly a libertarian system or something like that. I should say I'm a liberal, not a libertarian, although I do write about libertarianism. So I think that I'm not wedded to a particular economic system in that sense. And I think that we can have very fruitful conversations about different economic systems and the way that we could fit animal rights or more broadly respectful treatment of animals into those economic systems. And I'm excited about work that does that. I'm excited about work that takes different economic structures, different political structures, different moral structures, different legal structures, and says, how can we fit animals in here, right? To use the Rawlsian idea of overlapping consensus, I think it's really valuable that we can make arguments for animal rights that are, how can I put this, amenable to or acceptable to or attractive to people who advocate very different moral, political, economic, religious, legal, etc. visions. So, I can tell you what my own are, or I can tell you the ones that I find useful for animal rights. but I think that there's value in exploring lots of them.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So, taking a different direction, what is your opinion on those who say that plants could, in theory, be like animals, even though they don't have a brain, organs, or a nervous system? I've heard arguments that they all have the 8 characteristics of life, and that is the same as animal murder when we eat them, or that it is the same as animal murder when we eat them. I'd love to know your answer.
Yep, super. So plants are certainly alive. However, I do not think that life is a necessary or sufficient, maybe it's necessary. It's certainly not a sufficient condition for rights.
It might be best.
Yeah, it might be necessary. I don't know, but maybe there'll be a question about AI later. Who knows? A lot of people ask me about robots. They have done since I started working on this. But anyway.
Yeah, McPherson got a question about them, actually, interestingly.
Yes, well, Jeff Sable's doing very interesting work on this at the moment, but he doesn't come from a rights perspective. Now, my view on plants is quite simple. The most compelling evidence I've seen, and I've read a good bit around, plant neurobiology and the various things that go on with fungi and communication between plants and fungi and these kinds of things. But the best available evidence seems to suggest that although plants are far more sophisticated than we give them credit for, they are not the kinds of beings who possess sentience. I'm a sentientist. I believe that in order to have interests of a morally salient kind, one needs to be sentient. We can talk about the interests of a plant insofar as, certain things are good or bad for the plant's kind of small f flourishing, small f to distinguish it from the kind of rich Aristotelian sense. That is, they're going to do better or worse at staying alive, at breeding, etc. However, I don't think the plant cares. I'm continually drawn back to the old quote from Thomas Nagel in the essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Is there something that it is like to be that being? There is something that it is like to be a bat. It might be quite hard for us to, imaginatively inhabit batness, but I'm not convinced that there is something that it's like to be a tree. I'm not convinced that there is something that it is like to be a can of drink. I'm not convinced that there is something that it's like to be a mushroom. There may or may not be something that it is like to be a butterfly. There may or may not be something that it is like to be a worm. There certainly is something that it is like to be a bat, something that it is like to be a fish, by which I mean like a bony fish, trout, say, or a salmon. So if we're looking at this kind of what is it like to be, is there something that is like to be a being? Is this being sentient? And we can go into the notion of sentience if people are interested. Then
yeah, I think that'd be good.
Yeah, okay. So I normally gloss sentience very simply as the capacity to feel pleasure and pain. I think that is a useful, if non-technical definition. My technical definition, which I defend in my forthcoming book, Food, Justice and Animals, Feeding the World Respectfully, is, let me get my wording right, the capacity for valenced experience. That is, there is something that it is like to be a being, and there is a sense in which that being cares, right? They are, in a loose sense, happy or sad about certain experiences. So pain is a negatively valenced experience. It is bad. It feels bad. Pleasure is a positively valenced experience. It feels good. But there are other valenced experiences that are neither pain nor pleasure. Satisfaction, for example, might not be particularly pleasurable, but it's positively valenced. Boredom might not be particularly painful, but it's negatively valenced. And it's at least conceptually possible that there are some beings who have valenced experience but do not experience pleasure and pain. This is a slightly sci-fi example, but there may be animals out there that have experienced something like this. There may be animals who can experience satisfaction but not pleasure. There may be animals who experience frustration or fear but not pain, right? Bees, for example, I think, there's at least a plausible argument that bees experience something like fear, yet at the same time might not experience pain. I'm certainly not saying that's my view. I'm just saying it's a plausible story. There's a plausible story we could tell. So on that account, or if that were the case for bees, they would be sentient in the sense that I use it, but not sentient in the sense of experiencing pleasure and pain. So pleasure and pain is a useful shorthand. Capacity for valenced experience is a more technical definition as I would use it. anyways, in order to have interests, in order to have rights, I think we need an animal needs to be sentient in that sense. And my reading of the best available science suggests that plants are not sentient in that sense. And so I don't think that there is a direct wrong to them in harming them. There might be indirect wrongs. For example, chopping down a tree that a bird's nesting in is bad for a bird. And of course, we might want to say that even if we don't owe anything to the tree themselves, they might be the kinds of being that have some sense of value, right? They might have inherent value. But that is stepping away a little bit from the kind of rights framework that I would go for, though I'm open to that kind of story.
Interesting. All right. So what about oysters and bivalves?
Yep.
And someone also asked about shrimp as well. So yeah.
Great. Well, again, I would say the question comes down to sentience. My reading is that oysters are probably not sentient, in fact, almost certainly not sentient. So I'm inclined to think it's okay to eat them. I never have eaten them, and I have no particular desire to eat them, but I'm not sure there's anything all that wrong with eating them. And they are one of my kind of gold star examples in food justice and animals, because they seem to be a great example of an animal that we could eat while still respecting animal rights. I think that's really interesting and really important.
And why? Oh, sorry. Continue. Oh, I was just gonna say, could you maybe get into like why you're convinced about like that they aren't sentient? Like, is it specific capacities that they have, like something to do with the brain or nervous system, or what guides you to the view that they seem not sentient?
I'm trying to follow the science. I'm trying to follow existing scientific consensus, and there's a whole host of different accounts. Right, so let's put it like this: sentience is not the kind of thing that we can crack open a being and discover. Okay, so it's not like how can I put this? We can cut open a being and we can say, right, there's their heart, there's their brain, or we can say there's something that looks a bit like a heart, there's something that looks a bit like a brain. So we can have a pretty concrete answer as to whether a particular being has a heart, although there may be edge cases where we can say, we're not quite sure if this counts as a heart or not. That wasn't a great example because biology is messy. Okay, we can look into an atom. We can look at an atom and determine whether there's any hydrogen in the atom. Okay, and so if we have the right kinds of tools, we can identify whether hydrogen is present in an atom. Simple. Maybe the science is complicated, but conceptually it's quite simple. We don't have those kind of tools for sentience. So all we can do is rely on various other kinds of measures. How does the animal behave? How is the animal's nervous system structured? Does the animal have a nervous system? Does the animal have a brain? What's the kind of evolutionary story that may or may not benefit this animal when it comes to experiencing pain or other aversive states, and so on? Now, the science of invertebrate sentience is relatively underdeveloped. And that's because existing studies of animal sensation have mostly focused on vertebrates. And so the kinds of models that we have to search for this capacity is modeled around vertebrates, and invertebrates might function in quite different ways. So there's a complicating factor there. When you read the literature on animal sentience, the go-to example that's normally used is jellyfish. I think that the scientists who work in this area all seem pretty clear that jellyfish are not sentient. Now, that's not as interesting a conclusion for me because, of course, jellyfish aren't widely eaten. They are eaten. I was very interested to find jellyfish for sale in a local Chinese supermarket. Yeah, they're eaten in Korea, they're eaten in Japan, in China, in Vietnam, a number of places in the Far East. However, they're not particularly familiar to Western European consumers, and I assume most North American consumers as well. But yeah, jellyfish are eaten. However, oysters are more familiar, so oysters are the example I lean on a little bit more strongly in the book. So if you're asking me what particular thing is it about oysters that proves they're not sentient, well, I can't give you that because I don't think I have proof that they're not sentient. In fact, I don't think I have proof that any animal is sentient or not sentient. But what we do have are a range of factors that lead into that consideration, such as facts about their mobility and facts about their behavior, facts about their nervous system or lack thereof, facts about their evolutionary history, facts about their brain or lack thereof, and so forth.
All right. Fantastic. Thanks so much for that. So now, I'm going to be getting into some wild animal suffering.
Right.
So, what are our best strategies? So this is kind of like a three-parter, maybe potentially four. So we're going to take it one by one. What are our best strategies for curbing wild animal suffering?
Our best strategies for curbing it.
That's a pretty broad
I'm not
question.
necessarily an advocate. No, I'm just thinking about how to address this. So I should say I'm not necessarily an advocate of curbing wild animal suffering. Right. So here's a one-sentence clarification, then a one-sentence answer. My one-sentence clarification is, I alternate between being read as a very conservative advocate of intervention to alleviate wild animal suffering, or a very sympathetic critic of intervention to alleviate wild animal suffering. I sit somewhere on the borderline there. So depending on what room I'm in, I'm either a critic or an advocate. In terms of our best chance, I think that Carl Johansson is probably right that gene drives are the way to go if we want to curb wild animal suffering, to the point where eventually we have altered the genome of a whole host of different animals and indeed plants. The complicated thing is that if we want to get serious about, the number of young that particular animals have, or predation habits or whatnot, then realistically we need to be changing lots of different animals at once, because we need to alter a whole ecosystem at once. And I'm not sure we are yet in a position to do that. So if we are wanting to go in that direction, right now we need to be supporting research into gene drives, and possibly starting gene drives in very contained ecosystems or very particular situations, such as island ecosystems.
All right. So then I guess that goes directly into the follow-up to that one was, what do you think about like birth control to limit overpopulation? And then the follow-up to that is to continue, do you think this violates some sort of dignity norm in the animal's part? I have a good friend who is this question is actually from me. So I have a good friend and who is very opposed to, say, even feeding obligate carnivores lab meat due to it being undignifying in a certain way. He's a sort of Catholic guy, so. And then I also recently talked to another natural law theorist who found birth control to be similarly undignifying. Yeah. How would you reply to those arguments?
Great. So I'm actually pretty okay with birth control, insofar as we need to control animal populations. That's the way to do it, right? Rather than with a gun. But I stress insofar as, because I think sometimes we're very quick to say, oh, well, we need to control this animal population, when really what we should be doing is learning to live with the animal. So, is it undignifying? I think that. So let me first say about feeding carnivores lab-grown meat or similar. I think one of the most compelling theorists of animal dignity is Martha Nussbaum, who has the capabilities approach to protecting animal dignity. Nussbaum is someone whose theoretical perspective is very radical, but her practical suggestions end up being surprisingly mild. Nonetheless, she has a wonderful passage where she says, look, we need to protect animal capabilities to preserve their dignity, to recognize their dignity. However, we don't protect capabilities for capability's sake. Instead, what we need to do is we need to assess the capabilities to determine whether they are the kinds of things that are A, central to a being's flourishing, and B, the kinds of things that are morally acceptable, morally laudable. So a wonderful example of this in the human case, she says, we have the capability to be racist. However, this is not particularly central to our flourishing, and even if it was, it's not the sort of thing that we should be championing and supporting. Therefore, the capability to be racist is not the kind of thing that needs to be protected as a matter of justice. Something similar is true of animals. So she uses the example of an animal in a zoo, and we can of course worry about zoos. I think it's a big cat, I think it's a puma or something like that. And this particular animal is not given a gazelle to chase. Instead, the animal can exercise her capabilities through attacking a tire on a swing. So the capability is there, but we need to find a way that it can be practiced in a way compatible with respect for others. And lab-grown meat, I think, offers that kind of opportunity insofar as carnivorous animals have a capability that is important for their dignified flourishing in eating meat. Okay, so that's the first thing to say. Controlling animal populations, I'm not inclined to go the dignity route, but I do think we could tell a plausible story about many non-human animals having an interest in raising young, in having children, if that's the right phrase, in having free sexual relationships and then free kind of family relationships. And if they do have that interest, then plausibly they have a right in that area, and plausibly we can violate their rights by introducing birth control. I would say that we need to ask seriously how strong that interest is and whether there might be overriding considerations. So that would be my kind of one-line answer there. I'm not convinced that it's a very strong interest, even if it is an interest, which it may or may not be. And so it's the kind of interest that could be overridden in cases where there are serious countervailing concerns. The final thing I would say is I think there's a compelling or somewhat compelling ecofeminist worry here, which is about the hubris that we display when we barge into ecosystems or wild animal populations and start throwing our weight around. I do think, following the kind of Donaldson-chemical line I was introducing earlier, I do think we might plausibly say that animals have an interest in us leaving them be to a certain extent. And I think that if we are going to intervene in wild animal populations to reduce wild animal suffering, we need to seriously ask whether we are doing so in a way that respects the interest that they have in control over their own future and control over their own spaces. And that, I think, is one of the reasons I worry about jumping in to try and alleviate wild animal suffering. And this is the sort of line, this is the sort of argument I try to develop in the final chapter of Just Fodder, where I talk about the ethics of feeding wild animals.
Awesome. All right, and so now someone wrote a little bit of a more detailed thing regarding culling predators.
Go ahead.
So, hello, Dr. Milburn. My question relates to the issue of predation and the rights of wild animals. It's basically name the trait, but applied to the ethics of killing predators. Name the trait is a sort of a formalization of like a marginal cases type argument. Here, I think to explain it well enough here, but presumably you would morally approve of someone shooting and killing a predator, like a lion, that was about to eat an innocent human being alive, provided that using lethal force was the only way to save that human. So my question is, would it be morally justified in your view to shoot and kill a predator that eats innocent non-human animals alive to survive, also provided that using lethal force is the only way to save these animals? If you provide different answers in the human versus animal context, then what's the morally significant difference between the first and the second case that justifies the difference in treatment?
Brilliant. What a great question. That's a fantastic question. Okay. Let me think. Okay, so the first thing to say is when we're using lethal force to defend the innocent, I'm going to appeal to ethics of warfare again here. When we're applying lethal force to protect the innocent, we need to ask about proportionality. Okay, so if I see an innocent human who is about to be here's a nice example. Let's say I see an innocent human is about to have her hair bobble stolen from her hair, right? Which will be slightly painful and she'll lose some of her property, okay? And the only way I could feasibly stop this, because I happened to be at the time looking through the scope of a sniper rifle, the only way I could feasibly stop this is a headshot, okay? A headshot on the person who's going to steal the bauble. I do not think that is justified. That is a disproportionate response, even though it is protecting the innocent. What's the relevance of this? Well, I believe that non-human animals, in most cases, right, there's going to be an obvious marginal cases / species overlap concern here, but in most cases, non-human animals have a weaker interest in continued life than do humans. That means that the killing of a lion may, I'm just setting out an area here, I'm not necessarily endorsing anything, but the killing of a lion may be proportionate when it comes to protecting an innocent human, while it may not be proportionate when it comes to protecting an innocent gazelle, given the relative levels of harm. That is the harm of death to the human, the harm of death to the gazelle. So that's one set of considerations. A second set of considerations concerns the how can I put this? The normatively salient relationships that exist in particular cases. So I think that we might have, again, this is an in many cases situation, and I'm not appealing to a bright species line here, but in many cases we may have more obligations to assist humans than we do to assist wild animals because of the kinds of relationships we're in with them. An extreme example might be if the person who is about to be attacked by a lion is someone who has contracted me to act as their bodyguard. Right? In that case, I clearly have a very significant normative relationship with them that might even mandate me to intervene in certain kinds of cases. However, there are going to be counterexamples to both of these when you might say, well, in that case, you might say that in those counterexample cases, where the normatively salient relationships do not hold between me and the human, and or the different levels of interest in continued life between the human and the wild prey animal don't hold. And in those kind of cases, it does seem to be a completely relevantly similar situation. So our response should be the same in each case. What's my response?
Yeah. Are we killing the lions?
Are we killing the lions? I think that's an absolutely excellent question. My instinct right now is to say that if animals have rights, they have to have rights to self-defense, and we can defend them when doing so is proportionate. So I'm open to the suggestion that we could defend animals by killing their predators. However, I'm certainly not of the view that would be mandatory because of the lack of existing relationship between us and the wild animals. I do think it might be mandatory for me to protect my dog using lethal force if that's the only route open and it's proportionate. But I think that it's important to draw a distinction between mandatory action and permissible action. So I think this self-defense argument is very, very clever, and I think it's a great way to force me to become an interventionist. And this is exactly what I mean about the fact that I end up being a very conservative interventionist, because it seems like a lot of my arguments, although they seem to start from a non-interventionist place, end up quite interventionist when certain kinds of considerations are applied. But yes, fantastic question. Thank you.
Okay. So sort of in a similar vein, I was just thinking, so would you say we have greater responsibilities to those within our political communities than those that are not?
Yeah. I think we often do, yeah. It can depend on the kind of obligation, right? So, for example, I think it's plausible, for example, that I have duties to listen to the views of people in my political community in a way that I might not to people outside of my political community, insofar as we are both citizens of the same society, right? I think that's plausible. Now, David Miller, as some of you may know, well, you may not know, David Miller quite controversially defends the claim that we have, it can be permissible for us to save or favour our co-nationals over people who are not our co-nationals, though of course co-national is not quite the same as political community membership. These are slightly different concepts. I think that something like that is defensible. I don't know whether I would commit to it, but I do think that the fact that we exist in a relationship with people with whom we share citizenship, and that does seem to offer some minimal, quite small duties towards them that we do not have towards others.
Yeah, this is a tricky one, because definitely like with my family, right, I feel like I definitely have greater responsibilities there. But I would feel like it'd be a little strange if like there was a trolley problem, and I'm like, oh wait, that guy's from Canada and this guy's from the US? Well, that's definitely a reason favoring saving the US guy. Like, that seems a little odd, right?
I agree. And like I say, I think it's very minimal. And I should say, just in case I'm misunderstood, I'm not making this argument about race. I don't find that a compelling claim. But I think that because a shared race doesn't seem to be a relationship in any meaningful sense, but shared membership of a particular kind of community, such as a political community, does seem to be a kind of relationship. It puts you in a kind of relationship with that person. Now, the framework I develop in Just Fodder is a relational framework, but relation is looked at only in the lens of positive duties. Okay, so I think that the negative duties we have towards others are not inflected and not impacted by the relationship that we have with them. So to put it starkly, you can't kill anyone. You can't kill anyone, no matter your relationship with them. You know that they all have a right not to be killed, and all sentient animals, sentient animals also have rights, and that doesn't depend upon the relationship that we have with them. But when it comes to the duties we have to assist others, I think the relationship does start to matter. Okay, and that might sound abstract, but let me use an example from a recent paper. If you think about my dog and a stray dog and a wild dog, all of whom might be hungry, right? I need to, and I'm going to feed them, or I'm thinking about feeding them. Even though my dog, the wild dog, the stray dog, they might all be sentient, they might all be just as intelligent and emotionally sophisticated as each other, etc. It seems pretty clear to me that I have many more duties to my companion dog, and maybe some more duties to the stray dog than I do to the wild dog. That is, in those situations where assistance is required, I am obliged to help my dog first. All else equal, right? There's always an all else equal clause here.
Right.
If things aren't equal, then we can have another conversation. But I think that this again is one of the ways that I depart from a consequentialist, strict consequentialist. I do think that the positive duties we have to others concern the various kinds of entanglements that we have with them, whether that's relationships to them, responsibility for their suffering, and so on and so forth. There's a whole host of different kinds of factors.
All right. Awesome. Well, thanks so much. So, next question. Are you sympathetic to notions of sentience hierarchies, whereby some non-human animals' interests ought to carry more weight than others in moral decision-making? What are your thoughts on the charge of such hierarchies being invariably anthropocentric, in that the features commonly regarded as important, cognitive complexity, self-recognition, tool use, tend to conveniently be things humans possess, rather than capacities which non-humans possess, and are likewise important to them: flight, seeing sonar, or catching prey using the sounds of their shrieks, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me say two things before I say the sense in which I am sympathetic to them. So first of all, I'm inclined, I think this is mostly a linguistic disagreement, but I'm inclined to see sentience as a binary. A being is sentient or they are not, right? I don't really think that there are kind of hierarchies of sentience, or there are kinds of gradations of sentience. However, the reason I say it's a linguistic difference, I of course recognize that different sentient beings may have very different interests, and they may experience different intensities of feeling. They might have access to very high levels of pain or very low levels of pain. And these things affect the strength of the interest that they have, and indeed, of course, affect which interest they have. So whether a being has an interest in X depends upon their capacities in relation to X, and the strength of a being's interest in X depends upon their capacities in relation to X too. So that is the sense in which I am somewhat sympathetic to that. I've already alluded to the fact that I think that many non-human animals, I think that different animals, human or non-human, have different levels of interest in continued life. And so I think that it is worse for the being themselves to be killed in some cases than in others. It is worse for me, myself, to be killed than it is for, much as I hate to say it, my dog to be killed, right? For me, my death is very, very bad. For my dog, her death is just very bad, right? Now, what the kind of normative impact of that is a slightly separate question. So the only other thing I will say is that I am currently in the process of exploring this kind of question, a question of moral hierarchy, through a book project I've just started on the work of Robert Nozick. Robert Nozick, some of you may know, was an American libertarian political philosopher. His politics is maybe not something that many animal advocates are very sympathetic to. However, he was a vegetarian and he spoke a lot about animals in his work. And I'm currently trawling through his various books to find all the discussions of animals and work out how they fit together. But one of the things he says is he does start to develop a kind of value hierarchy, which I think is very interesting. And I'm certainly not saying I'm an advocate of it, but I think that he's the kind of person who offers a quite defensible view of that sort. Another person who does, probably actually more defensible than Nozick's, so I should mention, is Jeff McMahon, who is an Oxford professor of philosophy, who has published quite a bit on animals, including wild animal suffering, and he develops something with a kind of Nizickian flavour, whereby different beings, and it's not about species, it's about capacities, different beings with different levels of capacity are all different kinds of treatment.
All right, thank you. So next, in your view, is phenomenal consciousness the feature from which you establish the normative significance of animals? Are you swayed by arguments from indeterminacy, which suggest that in lieu of a methodological, empirical standard or sound psychological or physiological basis from which we can establish sentience, that we should be reluctant to ground moral concern in such indeterminate phenomenal concepts and maybe prefer a biocentric systems-based approach instead?
Good question. So yes, roughly, I'm concerned with phenomenology. So as I said earlier, it's about sentience as I define the term in order to ascertain whether a being has interests. So that is a phenomenological account. I absolutely accept that it's indeterminate, again, as I was talking about earlier. So I think that we have very difficult questions to ask in those cases where we are just really not sure. And I spend a good bit of time in my next book exploring those kind of edge cases, like insects. I think insects are a perfect example of an edge case. My reading of the literature, although there's been a lot of changing of minds of this over the last few years and indeed the last few months in the scientific literature. But anyways, my reading, at least at the time I was writing the book, was that they probably weren't sentient, but there was a decent chance they were. So we need to work out how to treat them given that uncertainty. However, and that's a difficult question. However, no, it does not lead me towards a kind of biocentric account, which I don't find particularly plausible.
Did you want to expand on why you don't find the biocentric account super plausible?
Yeah, well, first of all, the systems-based account I find kind of troubling because I'm left not quite clear. Well, there's a few different things that might be meant by systems-based account, but if we're meaning systems-based pushing towards a kind of ecosystem approach, I'm not quite clear on what the individual is who is owed something here. I'm not quite clear on in what sense ecosystems exist outside of the individual beings that make up the ecosystem, the nodes of the relationships, if you like. So, and it goes back to what I was saying about me not being clear that there is anything that it is like to be a plant. It's not quite clear that anything can go better or worse for the plant. And why do I think it's bad for people to do awful things to me? Well, it's because things seem to go better or worse for me because of it. And so if I want to stick with the idea that the sense in which awful things done to me are bad is because of the way they make things go worse or better for me, then I want to try and extend that same idea to other beings as well. And I can't make sense of that when it comes to plants. So when you encounter biocentric or ecocentric ethical systems, I'm troubled with where humans fit into them. So sometimes humans fit in the same way that other beings do, and then awful treatment of humans is justified. Sometimes humans fit in a different way, in which case we are kind of biocentrists or ecocentrists, except when it comes to humans, when we, take a rights view or something. And then suddenly I'm a little puzzled. I'm not quite clear on how these two things fit together. So one case seems to be abhorrence, the other case seems to be special pleading. And so I'm not attracted to either.
All right. Thank you. So do you, last one from Jordan, that's what the last 3 questions have been from. Do you find Christopher Bobier's account of virtuous omnivorism persuasive? The view that it should be, that if we should pursue harm reductive ends, that vegans should consume those who Bobier regards as demanding less moral consideration, such as insects, or those whose consumption would result in fewer deaths per calorie consumed, such as a whale with 300 million calories each, as opposed to implicate ourselves in harms imposed by industrial plant production.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'll let you all in on a secret. I was actually the peer reviewer for that paper, or one of the peer reviewers, so I know that paper very
Oh,
well.
wow. Great.
Yeah, small world. So my answer is very simple. Yes, I think it's a fantastic argument insofar as we're virtue ethicists. I'm not a virtue ethicist, so I don't find it persuasive for that reason. However, as far as virtue ethics goes, I think it's a brilliant argument and very, very compelling.
Would you be able to go over for anyone who hasn't read the paper why you think it works for virtue ethicists, but not for, I assume you have some sort of moderate deontic view yourself?
Oh, well, yeah. So, I mean, the argument as presented is straightforwardly a virtue ethics argument. So it says something like, well, what would how would the virtuous person respond to animal suffering? Well, they'd be very worried about it. You know, they would act in such a way as they could to alleviate it. And sometimes it seems like the way to act to alleviate. I'm summarising the argument horrendously here, but sometimes the way to act to alleviate it is going to be to favour animal-based foods, such as the new omnivore foods. So I think that there are a few existing virtue ethics cases for meat eating from the likes of Scruton, Roger Scruton, that is. There's also some virtue ethics cases for veganism. Carlo Alvaro is a nice example. I don't find Alvaro's work very compelling. I don't find it particularly well argued, if I may say that. Nonetheless, he's someone who if you're looking for a virtue ethicist who defends veganism, he's the go-to. I'd really love to see some virtue ethicists take Bobier's argument on and say, look, here's where it goes wrong on virtue ethics grounds. I'm not the person to do that because I'm not kind of up to my eyeballs in virtue ethics. But I'd be interested to see what kinds of arguments could be drawn from virtue ethics to challenge this.
Interesting. Maybe Cheryl Abate might want to tag in there. I guess she's a virtue ethicist, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Well, she's a Reaganite, or at least in a lot of her work, she starts from Tom Reagan's rights view. So I've always kind of seen her as on my side, although I'm not strictly speaking a Reaganite, I'm a rights theorist more broadly. Anyway. But her work's fascinating because she takes Reagan and kind of ends up turning him into something quite consequentialist. So she's done a lot of work on how Reagan's framework would apply in cases where harm seems inevitable either way. And yeah, I find it very, very interesting. Yeah. So she has written about virtue stuff, but I'll be quite honest, I think she has, but I've not read it, so I couldn't say where she stands on virtue ethics.
Awesome. All right. So, why do you think a liberal political philosophy is adequate to establish an understanding of dignity? And if we can establish an adequate liberal dignity, can the concept escape anthropocentrism and establish a dignity which adequately protects humans and non-humans? My concern primarily comes from liberalism's failure to recognize the dignity of marginalized groups historically, and the liberal vindication of radicalism, the same radicalism which is required to recognize, begin, and succeed in emancipatory politics. I fear that liberal conceptions of dignity are simply aesthetic and therapeutic for moral agents and fail to evoke a duty to the other. The thinkers and authors who have primarily led me here are Baudrillard, Rancière, Levinas, and Cavell.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know any of those authors well. I'll be quite honest. So I can't comment on their particular concerns. What I will say, okay. So first of all, again, I'll flag that dignity isn't the kind of language I use, but I'll interpret that as a kind of concern for justice for animals, rights for animals, standing for animals, maybe. If that's all that's meant by dignity, then that's fine. I can roll with that. Liberalism is a political theory that has, at its core, notions of progress. Okay? At its core, it is not a political theory that stands still. It's a political theory that tries out new ways of living and gradually expands to include groups who have traditionally been excluded. I concede that it's not always been as quick as we might like, when that comes to marginalized human groups, and of course, when it comes to non-human animals. But it's a political theory that has room for these kinds of things. And it's a political theory that has resources that we can deploy to protect animals, such as rights theory, okay? Such as, democracy, such as these various other kinds of familiar political structures which can be utilized to protect animals. Is this the system that will be most animal friendly? No, of course not, right? A benevolent fascist government is going to be much more animal friendly than a liberal government. But there are other reasons we might be worried about a benevolent fascist government, right? If I was declared God King tomorrow, that's the kind of political system that could be very animal friendly compared to liberalism, even a very progressive liberalism. But there are reasons to be reluctant to support anyone being declared God King, unless you're Aristotle. Aristotle thinks that's great, but that's by the by. So that's kind of one answer. That's kind of why I'm inclined to think that liberalism is sufficient. Let me also add that given that we, or many of us, live in liberal societies, or given that many of us find ourselves surrounded by people who are more or less liberal, and let's be clear, liberal is a broad church here, right? Liberal includes people, well, all the major political parties in the UK are certainly on the liberal spectrum. In the US, it might be a bit different, but liberalism is a broad church. It's not simply a kind of centre-left ideology, as the word is sometimes used. Anyway, so given that we live in liberal societies or neoliberal societies, or we are surrounded by people who are liberals or neoliberals, I'm saying near, N-E-A-R, not neo. I don't really know what neoliberal is. Given that we are surrounded by
bad.
people... Yeah, exactly, yeah. Given that we are surrounded by these people...
I don't like.
Given that we're surrounded by these people and these structures, it's worth exploring what resources there are for animals within them. Okay, so I think even if we are not sympathetic to liberalism, and again, I should say I am sympathetic to liberalism, but even if we're not sympathetic to liberalism, I think there's good reason to be engaging with liberal ideas and liberal theory and liberal thought in order to try and make room for animals. And of course, this all comes, and I'll repeat it again, with the understanding that I very much welcome work on including animals in law, politics, morality, religion, etc., that are not coming from the kinds of philosophical or political or whatever positions that I find compelling. I think that there's lots of room for this. And, if there's someone here who is a cosmopolitan anarchist who says, well, cosmopolitan anarchism and animal rights, these things match together, great. I want to read your papers. I want to read your books. I want to hear about this. There's room for these conversations. Let's let 1,000 flowers bloom and let's try out all these different ideas. And if you can convince me that your cosmopolitan anarchism is the way forward, great, I'll join you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the response. So I guess I was thinking, what do you respond to basically a lot of the left-wing or leftist talking points regarding individuals having a right or a claim to everything produced by their labor, right? And the boss is reaping some of the surplus value or whatever. It's the worker did the work. The worker's entitled to all of the benefits from that, and thus we should not have more of a democratic economic system where workers are entitled to all the fruits of their labor. What do you think about that?
I'm open to a more democratic worker system. I think that's something that's worth exploring and worth talking about. Degrees of worker control over, their companies or the companies they work for, or the non-companies they work for, the way they do their work. However, I'm I'm open to the idea of contracts. I'm open to the idea that it's okay to agree to do something for someone, right? I'm open to the idea, for example, that if you said to me, hey, Josh, could you lend me a tenner? I'll give you 15 quid back in a week if you do. That's okay, right? Even though I'm making a five profit, this £10 is valuable to you, and you're an adult, I'm an adult, we are reaching an agreement, right? And of course, we can say, well, what are the circumstances that have led to this? Am I putting you under pressure? Am I taking advantage of a bad situation, etc., etc., etc.? And I think those are all worthwhile conversations worth having. But ultimately, I support the idea of adults being able to make agreements among themselves, and that, I think, is a fairly intuitive notion. And I worry that these kind of leftist systems that really push back against that are going to lead to people's lives being controlled in huge ways. No, you can't make those agreements, even though they sound completely plausible, completely intuitive. You're not allowed to do that because that upsets our system, or that upsets our model, or that leads to you gaining money in a way that we don't like. And I'm troubled by that. That seems to put a lot of power in the hands of the state.
Gotcha. Interesting. And what would you think about? Are you sympathetic to? A lot of times they'd reply like, maybe it seems a little different. The like money lending thing. It's when it comes to I have to have a job to live and to eat, right? I can't really not have a job, so I'm sort of forced into making this contract. Manufactured consent or whatever. I don't have an option. I have to take this deal, which is robbing me of the value of my labor. Are you sympathetic to any of those ideas at all, or?
I mean, I think there are systems that are more and less worker friendly, of course, and I think that there are some systems in which workers seem to be making choices that, well, they seem to be put in positions where they are forced to make a choice between a rock and a hard place, right? And that is problematic, that is regrettable, and we can have an interesting conversation about how to get people out of those kinds of situations, or how to limit the impact of those situations. More generally, I would like to see. So there's a classic John Stuart Mill idea of experiments in living. I would like to see ways that people could try and live together, and include animals in this, of course, as well, different ways of living with animals, but could live together that are very different from the current system of I have to get a job, I have to get a wage. I think one idea, and I'm not necessarily committing to this, but I'm very interested in it. One idea that I think is worth exploring is the idea of a universal basic income, so that people could step out of the work market if they chose to, even without either throwing themselves at the mercy of someone else or relying on something like inherited wealth. And that would be a system in which people weren't forced to work, and that would force employers to make offers much more attractive to people. I think those kind of ideas are interesting. Now, interestingly, the literature on universal basic income has been put into conversation with the literature on animals by at least one pairing, and that's, again, Donaldson and Kimlicka, in this book called Animal Labour, which was co-edited by Charlotte Blattner, Kendra Coulter, and Will Kimlicka. And they wrote the final chapter, and it was about animals in a post-work society. Really interesting stuff.
Oh, interesting. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for that. So this question is just, could you explain your paper, Should Vegans Compromise?
Good. So the backstory to this paper is that a chap called Marcus Hunt wrote a paper called Parental Compromise. And this paper was about what parents should do when they disagree about how to raise a child. However, I mean, that's what it was on the face, but really it was about veganism. Really, it was about what happens when one parent wants to raise a child vegan and the other parent does not. And the argument that he comes up with is something like, well, they should try and find a middle ground. Compromise is a good thing. And so they should, feed them a vegetarian diet, or feed them a nearly vegan diet, or vegan some days, or, something like that. They should reach a compromise. And that all sounds fair enough. But I said, look, compromise is a great thing. In some cases, and parental compromise is absolutely something we should cheer for in many, many cases. But I said animal rights are different. Why are animal rights different? I said, well, animal rights are a matter of justice, okay? And they're things that we have to do. they're things that I believe the state should be enforcing, but even while the state is failing to enforce them, I believe that we have to do them. This is not just something that would be nice for us to do. It's not just something we can kind of disagree about. No, this is a matter of justice. It's foundational. So I said that actually parents shouldn't compromise on the issue of respecting animal rights. The reason this gets complicated, and this goes back to something I was saying earlier, is I believe that there is actually a gap between animal rights and veganism. So if a vegan parent and a non-vegan parent wish to compromise, or if we try to seek a compromise, there is space for them to compromise on veganism, but it's through exploring those animal products that seem to respect animals, or seem to be consistent with animal rights, such as the eating of non-sentient animals, such as the eating of meat that would otherwise go to waste, such as the products of cellular agriculture. Now, you might say, oh God, these are kind of weird products. Well, not so much, actually. Many non-sentient animals, or many animals who are plausibly non-sentient, are available in most supermarkets, or at least they are in this country. And those of you who are based in the States have access to the products of cellular agriculture through the milk produced by Perfect Day, sold through their brand Brave Robot, and indeed other brands. So there are cellular agriculture products available to you, or to many of you. There are non-sentient animals available as food for many of you, I strongly suspect. And so this might be the area that we could compromise on if we have one parent who wants to raise a child vegan and the other parent who does not. So you might think, well, that's not much room to compromise on, and I'd be inclined to agree. But it's more than you might think, given that animal rights are a matter of justice, and so not the kind of thing that are suitable for compromise.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. So our next question is, I guess I'll roll this all into one. Someone asked, is there any plant-based foods or plant-based non-food products which you do not consider vegan? And then someone else asked, what do you think about the minority of vegans who say figs are not vegan? So I guess you can answer those at once.
Lovely. Okay, so I follow Jan Dukowitz and Jonathan Dickstein in supporting a practice-based definition of veganism. So I understand veganism as roughly synonymous with a plant-based diet, roughly. Of course, veganism stretches beyond diet to other products. So I believe that all plant-based products are vegan kind of by definition. I accept that there are many plant-based products that are more or less ethically supportable ethically. Some are a little ethically dubious. Some might be a little more environmentally unfriendly. Many might be produced in ways that are not respectful to human workers, and so those are products that we should be avoiding, and similar. Now, and some of them, of course, may be produced in ways that are not very respectful to animals. On figs, I kind of wanted to write a paper about figs, but I worried it might be a bit niche. But I keep seeing it coming up in the news and coming up in these kind of gotcha moments. Figs aren't vegan. For those of you who don't know, fig trees are pollinated by fig wasps. And what happens is the wasp enters the flower and then dies in the flower, or is trapped in the flower and dies in the flower, and is then dissolved by the plant. So it is not the case that if you eat fig, you're eating bits of wasp. That's a myth. The wasp is gone, right? You're eating atoms that were once in the wasp, but then, you're eating atoms from all kinds of things that have decomposed and gone into the soil. So the analogy is more like, a plant growing in soil that was once, a body of an animal, than it is to eating bits of wasp. Nonetheless, we might want to say that given that animals are involved in the process, this is non-vegan, or this is ethically questionable. I think there's a distinction to be drawn between whether this is a wild wasp that has entered the fig of his or her own accord, and if it is animals who have been deliberately kind of captured and introduced. That might make a big difference. Now, there's also the complicating factor that we can ask a question about whether fig wasps are sentient. So as you can see, there's a whole host of ethical puzzles here, which is why I think it might make for a fun paper if a bit of a niche one. However, the bottom line is I do sometimes eat fig. So I am of the view that fig is vegan, and I am of the view that fig is probably something that is no less ethically dubious than any other plant that is pollinated by insects, which is, let's be clear, almost all of them.
All right, and I guess I just was wondering why do you choose to take a sort of practice-based definition of veganism as opposed to, say like the Vegan Society's definition?
Well, the Vegan Society's definition I do actually take to be a practice-based one, but it's a curious definition because it kind of bets on the top. Sorry, this isn't a very vegan metaphor, but it kind of bets on the top three horses in its own definition. So if you try to kind of disentangle the Vegan Society's definition, you kind of get 3 or 4 different definitions because there's lots of and, including, etc. in there. So I read it as a mostly practice-based definition, actually. Rather than anything else. But I think one of the reasons I'm drawn to a practice-based definition is because if we don't have a practice-based definition, we end up with veganism just being a diet that is consistent with animal rights, or something. That's the direction I'd go if it wasn't a practice-based direction. And then we get into difficult territory because we're going to disagree, right? We're going to disagree about which is a diet compatible with animal rights. So I find it more useful to say something like this. Veganism is a diet that seems to be compatible with animal rights. That is, a plant-based diet is a diet that seems to be compatible with animal rights, but it's an open question whether it's the only one or whether it's the best one, right? Because I find it's at least, in some other world, it would be the case that the Davis Archer style diet of cows, grass-fed cows, would be a diet that's compatible with animal rights. I don't think in this world it is, but it's at least plausible that it could be. But I think it would be a kind of mistake to call that a vegan diet. Now, I should say that I have called it a vegan diet because I've called it a burger vegan diet. But I use the word burger vegan, and that's Andy Lamey's term originally. I use the word burger vegan in scare quotes because it seems to me that isn't a vegan diet, however you cut it, even if it might be a diet that, at least in theory, could be compatible with animal rights.
Gotcha. All right, well, thank you so much for that. All right, next. In your paper, The Animal Lover's Paradox on the Ethics of Pet Food, you discuss dignity arguments in favor of feeding animal products to companion animals. You claim that the person claiming that non-vegan diets promote the dignity of some companion animals faces the problem of clarifying why a vegan diet is undignified. One, if we were to claim that argument doesn't work because a non-vegan diet is not dignified, could this be used as an argument against eating or feeding companion animals lab meats? Two, if it is dignified, actually, all right, there's 3 of them, and that's too much, so we'll start with the 1, and then we'll move on to the 2 after. So yeah, one is...
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, if we were to claim that this argument doesn't work because a non-vegan diet is not dignified, could this be used as an argument against eating or feeding companion animals lab meat?
Okay, that's a complicated question. If it was the case that a non-vegan diet is undignified, then yes, that would be an argument against feeding lab meat because, on my definition, a diet containing lab meat is not a vegan diet. However, I don't think I do say that a non-vegan diet is undignified. I simply say that a vegan diet is not undignified.
Gotcha.
But I may be wrong about that. If I am wrong about that, I invite whoever asked that question to correct me, because I may have forgotten what I said.
Is he? Oh, unfortunately, he looks like he's not in the audience right now. Or I'd get him to come up. But all right. So 2, if it is dignified for an omnivorous companion animal to eat a vegan diet and also dignified for them to eat a non-vegan diet consisting of lab meat, what would you say about them eating lab meat grown from cells from specific groups of marginalized humans like African or Jewish people? If that's wrong, what's the difference between marginalized human lab meat and marginalized animal lab meat?
Okay, that's a great question. Okay, well, if I understand the question correctly. So I'm actually of the view, and I've defended this in print several times, I'm actually of the view that there's nothing wrong with creating cultivated meat using human cells. And indeed, I'm open to that being fed to companion animals. And part of the reason I say that is precisely because I worry that if we say, oh, it's okay to produce it using animal cells but not human cells, that's drawing a bright line between humans and animals on species terms, and that I find quite worrying. Now, the reason this is relevant to pet food is people sometimes say something like, oh, but actually it's really unhealthy for people to eat human meat, so that would be a good reason not to produce it. And my response is, well, great, if that's the case, let's produce it for pet food. I do think there's room for producing it for human consumption as well if people want that. You know, there are lots of unhealthy foods, and I don't think we should ban foods just because they're unhealthy, even if they're very unhealthy, actually. That's a slightly different argument. But yeah, I do defend that at some length in the next book. So I think the other element of the question is about whether the cells would come from marginalized human groups or not, or kind of all human groups. And I think I would be worried if it was the case that for whatever reason, we were only producing cultivated meat using the cells of, I don't know, black people or Jewish people, I think was the other example, or people from lower socioeconomic background or something like that. I do think that might be quite worrying. And I think we should think seriously about how we're sourcing these cells, where we're sourcing them from, in the human case and in the animal case, of course. So there's a good literature on where we're getting these cells from in the animal case. In the human case, I'm inclined to think actually the issue is a bit simpler because humans can offer informed consent. Right, humans can give up their cells freely and can consent to their cells being given up in a way that non-human animals can't. So this isn't my argument, but I think someone could plausibly make the argument it's actually acceptable to make in vitro human flesh, but not in vitro animal flesh, because humans can freely give their cells, animals can't.
All right, awesome. Okay, all right. So, what do you think about non-human animals as being able to hold property, and if this impacts your view on backyard eggs, honey, and milk? I'm aware that you wrote a paper defending backyard eggs with Bob Fisher a couple of years ago. Interestingly, though, he did not seem super confident in the paper when he talked to us about it. So I guess I'm wondering where your where your head's at about it now.
Yeah, I'm sure Bob blamed all the bad bits on me. It's interesting. I'll get to backyard eggs in a second because I'm very happy to talk about that. But let me just say something about property first of all. So the animal property rights idea is something that's been defended by a bunch of people actually, but John Hadley was the person who really introduced me to it. So he has this great book from a while ago now, maybe 2015, called Animal Property Rights, A Theory of Habitat Rights for Wild Animals. And I found his approach fairly compelling. Some of the institutional aspects I found a little bit surprising, but broadly, he's of the view that wild animals need access to their spaces, and so they should be offered rights over their spaces. Now, this is a similar kind of argument to Donaldson and Kimlicka, just use in their sovereignty argument, just using a different kind of institutional proposal. And I have defended animal property rights, or at least I've explored animal property rights using Lockean approaches to property. And this was very much a philosopher's paper of a kind of, if we accept this argument, then we can get to this conclusion, rather than me endorsing anything too strongly. And maybe that's how Bob saw the paper he wrote with me on eggs. So, yeah, I think the property rights thing is very interesting. And if it is the case that animals own... Right, so let's get to chickens. If it is the case that backyard chickens own their eggs, that does create a difficulty for us taking them. Now, the backyard eggs paper, there's one line in it I regret, in all honesty, and that is where I mention the eggs being or the chickens being framed as workers, which is actually in the conversation about whether eggs are property. And the reason I regret that is because a lot of people have read that as saying that we have a right to the eggs, or if the chickens are not producing eggs, we can kick them out or something like that. So, and that's certainly not my view. The view instead is something like this. In a household, we can expect members to contribute insofar as they are able. Okay, in the same way it's okay to ask children to do chores around the house, perhaps the argument goes, it's all right to ask chickens to contribute to the running of the household, and what if they are able, and one way they could do that is through producing eggs. Now, if the eggs are the property of the chicken, we could construe them as giving up their property rights by the fact that often chickens actually leave eggs. They don't really mind. And that's partly because the breeds that are typically used for backyard eggs production, and indeed industrial level egg production, are breeds where broodiness, that is, a desire to sit on eggs and look after eggs, has basically been entirely bred out. So these individuals don't seem to mind if we take their eggs for the most part. There are exceptions. And that's kind of one way of going with this property rights thing. If I throw something away, I've renounced my property rights over it. Maybe the chickens are doing something similar. But then the other point, and this is where the worker renter kind of idea comes in, is we might say, look, even if that is their property, they can be expected to contribute to the household if they're able. In just the same way, if there's 5 people living in a house together, we can expect some of them to give up some of their property for the good of the household. For example, everyone has to chip in for rent. So I think that if the eggs are the property of the chicken, and that's an if, that doesn't necessarily defeat the claim that it can be legitimate to take them, though it certainly complicates the argument. And I should clarify for those of you who've not read my Backyard Chickens paper, there are a lot of problems with the way that people keep backyard chickens. There are a lot of awful things that people do to chickens. My view is something like this. If you have a large backyard and you are the kind of person who has the capacity to look after chickens, the expertise and the resources to look after chickens, and then you acquire chickens in a way that is respectful, for example, you rescue them in various ways, then if they lay some eggs, there's not much harm in eating them. That's roughly the argument. It is certainly not a defence of egg farming. It is certainly not a defence of the property status of chickens. It is certainly not a defence of slaughtering chickens.
Awesome. You mentioned something that made me think of another question about breeding. What would you think about, say these chickens did not have this brooding tendencies bred out yet?
Yeah.
Would you think it would be wrong to breed these chickens specifically to take out the brooding tendencies to allow for us to have this, quote, ethical backyard chicken farming?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And let me be quite honest, I don't know the answer to that. I'm yet to work out where I stand on this. I think that, the practices of messing around with animals' genetics through even quote unquote natural breeding can be pretty gruesome, right? And the kind of breeding we're imagining here, this is not inviting 2 chickens to go on a date together, However, it does seem like we could invite 2 chickens to go on a date with each other. We could set up some chickens, right? And, one thing will lead to another. And that can be a way that over generations we can influence animals. So without obviously wronging any particular animal, we might be able to direct the way that these animals, quote unquote, evolve. And I don't have an answer to that yet. I think that it's a really difficult question that I've grappled with and just not reached a conclusion on. So if anyone has an answer to that, I'd be very happy to hear it.
I wish I did. Unfortunately, ethics is hard.
Very, yeah. And it only gets harder when we start to introduce these kinds of genetic questions, because then we get into all kinds of weirdness about non-identity problems and,
Right.
beings who exist who would not otherwise have existed and all the rest of it. So I do grapple with some things adjacent to this when I revisit eggs in Food Justice and Animals Feeding the World Respectfully. And there I do talk about the possibility of a rights respecting egg farm. And as part of that, very unlike the egg farms that exist today, let's be quite clear, but I think possible, at least in theory. And there I do grapple in a big way with some questions about genetics, but not those ones, because those I just haven't reached an answer about the question you've asked.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. So you mentioning the non-identity problem made me realize this is the first AMA in area history where no one has asked about antinatalism. So I'm going to ask about antinatalism. And then also I wanted to ask about the logic of the larder, and if you think there's some sort of connection between the two there.
Yeah. Okay. So antinatalism is the belief that we should not be breeding as humans, or we can be antinatalists about animals, or we can be antinatalists about both. I am not an antinatalist in the strict sense, though I am worried about the way that many contemporary societies seem to encourage people to have children. I think this is a worrying tendency. I am not of the view that it would be good if the human race became extinct, but I think it's a question that's at least worth exploring. So yeah, I'm not strictly an antinatalist, though I'm perhaps more antinatalist than the mainstream view of having children. When it comes to animals, I think there are lots of animals, or lots of breeds of animals, who, on the whole, live lives that are not worth living. These incredibly kind of modified breeds of chicken, it's chicken I'm thinking about in particular, of chickens who, grow incredibly quickly, and, their bodies work against them in all kinds of horrible ways. And I think it might be better if those animals did not exist for them. So I think I might be an antinatalist when it comes to them. There's also the question of antinatalism and wild animals, and I think that's a very difficult question. And yeah, I mentioned genetic modification, gene drives, and so forth earlier, and I accept that if we want to eliminate wild animal suffering, then yeah, the most straightforward way to go is to stop wild animals existing. I'm being completely serious now. If you said, what's the quickest way to eliminate wild animal suffering? I would say total nuclear annihilation of the Earth, right?
Right.
Because if there's no animals, there's no suffering. However, the fact that that's the answer seems to me to suggest that there's at least some other important things going on than just trying to eliminate wild animal suffering. So what those other values are, I'm not sure, but I do think that eliminating suffering can't be our only goal, because if eliminating suffering was our only goal, extinction of all species, or all sentient species, would be the most straightforward answer, and that seems to be wrong. So that's where I stand on antinatalism. 3 different kinds of antinatalism.
Gotcha. Awesome. And so something a lot of random non-vegans will bring up is, oh, what are you gonna do with all the cows, right? And then they're like, oh, they're gonna overrun the world. And then the vegan's like, no, they're not. We're not gonna breed them. And then the response is usually like, oh, so you're just gonna like extinct them, or like provide like tons of birth control, and then you're just gonna have like less cows which actually had lives that were worth living. Maybe take a perfect Davis Archer grass-fed cow, lives an amazing life, maybe kill it at half its lifespan, but still, half a life that is significantly good is better than no life at all. So why are you vegans trying to extinct these species and deprive these species of valuable futures? How would you respond to those sorts of arguments?
Right. So first of all, I'll quote Nozick, who addresses this argument in Anarchy State Utopia, which, as I say, is a book defending right libertarianism, but has a fantastic series of passages about vegetarianism. And he says, look, once the animal exists, the animal has certain claims. Or at least he says it's plausible. I think they do. Once the animal exists, it has certain claims. So even if it were the case that, all things considered, it would be better... I'm not saying it would be. All things considered, it would be better if we bred these animals and then killed them so that lots of animals could live happy, if short lives. I would say, well, no, once the animal exists, you can't kill it. Can't kill him or her. So that argument just falls out the window. And it's really interesting, actually, because there was a recent paper defending that kind of view by Nick Zangwill, which has led to a bit of conversation in the kind of philosophy world, published in the Journal of the American Philosophical Association. And he addresses this point, and someone says, well, one of the objections, he said, well, what about humans? Could we do this with humans? And he says, well, no, humans have rights. It's like, the question against
the question.
Because, of course, many of us believe that animals have rights. So, yeah, I guess he would accept that his argument doesn't work if animals have rights. It's just animals don't have rights for reasons. So that's a kind of first response. A second response is, I do think there's actually a serious conversation to be had about whether we want to follow the kind of Gary Francione abolitionist line and say, well, yeah, let's make all these domesticated animals extinct. or whether we want to go the kind of Sue Donaldson, Will Kinlocher route and say, well, let's keep these animals around as members of our communities. That, of course, raises the question of how many of these animals would exist. If you're Donaldson and Kinlocher, I think reading between the lines, not many. So this is something I explore again. Sorry, this isn't meant to be a big advert for my next book, but of course, it's something on my mind at the moment.
Yeah.
But this is something I explore in Food, Justice and Animals, because I suggest that leaving room for certain animal products in the food system, of course, no room for slaughterhouses, that violates animal rights, but rooms for something like animal farms with, chickens producing eggs, animals producing cells for cultivated meat, and so on and so forth. Leaving room for some of this kind of thing does actually create space for these animals to live and flourish in a future animal rights respecting society. So I think that I would reject the view that I'm committed to extinction, while also rejecting the view that, the standard logic of the larder argument. I think there's a really interesting middle ground that we can thread here.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So, looks like in 5 minutes we'll be coming up on the 2-hour mark. So I think we're just going to go with one more question. And then you can give yourself some shout outs, plug the book again, and then we'll close it up. All right. So I want to ask about the necessity argument and whether you think it is a good argument. Often vegans talk about how unnecessary consuming animal products is, and that is a reason/argument for why it is bad and you should be vegan instead. On the one hand, it is good because that justifies in survival situations, which gets one out of scenarios like, oh, what about a desert island? While maintaining that if you have a supermarket, that it is wrong, but then it also entails that killing humans, if you're in need of organs, being justified. Thoughts?
Yeah, clever. Yeah, so I'm very much on board with the necessity argument, and I do think that it is permissible to kill animals in situations of dire need. And there are real humans in the world who are in those situations of dire need. I'm not sure I've ever met any of these people, despite the fact that I've been challenged with this many times. But yeah, I'm happy to kind of say, sure, yeah, it's okay to kill in those kind of situations. When it comes to the organ argument, I might again point towards the sort of levels of interest question and proportionality. So the interest that non-human animals have in continuing to live is normally much lower than we have. And that is part of the reason that we're allowed to kill them in situations of dire need.
May I ask? Oh, sorry. May I ask why you are convinced of that? That animals have, I can't remember the word used, but less of a sort of desire to live than interest?
Yeah. So I'm going to fall back on McMahon to a certain extent, Jeff McMahon, though Alistair Cochrane puts it very well as well. Basically, it's about the capacities that these animals have. And our understanding of the capacities that they have suggests that their life is less valuable to them than our life is to us for the most part. For example, they don't seem to be able to conceive of themselves as continuing beings. They have ongoing projects, but to a much more limited extent than we have. And they have lower access to future positive experiences than we have, or so it might seem. So very roughly, I take a deprivationist account of the badness of death, and what that means is I think the badness of death comes down to what it deprives us of. And as far as I can tell, for most non-human animals, they lose less in death than we lose. Now, of course, this varies from human to human as well. So I'll be the first to admit that there are some. Well, people find it a distasteful consequence, but I think it's quite a straightforward consequence, and it's something that we all kind of already understand. Some of us lose more when we die than others, and that might sound regrettable, but that's just kind of the way it is, and that I think has some interesting ethical consequences. So, yeah, that's the kind of line. That's part of the line I'll take to justify the necessity claim. As for killing people to harvest organs, yeah, that's really interesting because of course, all someone needs to do to counter my argument is to say something like, "Oh well, let's talk about a human who has a lower interest in continued life. Are we allowed to kill them to harvest their organs?" And no, my intuition is not. how am I going to justify that? That's a difficult question. So you put me in a very difficult, tight spot for the final question. Because okay. So let me just summarize. I want to be able to say yes, the necessity argument justifies the claim that we can't kill people. Sorry, we can kill animals when we're in dire need, and in fact, I would say that we can kill humans when we're in dire need as well. Although, of course, that becomes a bit more complicated. You know, if you and I are trapped on a desert island, I think we're probably both prima facie justified in attacking the other to kill and eat them.
Right.
At least that seems plausible to me.
Yeah.
Go ahead, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, that seems totally plausible. But then, you know, say I'm like,
But if we're both in
so,
hospital
like,
beds next to each other.
right, we're both in hospital beds next to each other, and I just, you know, I throw a knife at you or something. Well, that definitely seems wrong. But then say I'm like on a hospital bed and we need to, like, yeah, I don't know, kill a dog or something. That seems, yeah, I get why that would that one would seem acceptable and one wouldn't. Do you think, I mean, does it just come down to sort of like speciesist bias?
It might
that you
be.
think we have?
Maybe our intuitions are put awry by speciesist bias here. It's very interesting because there has been stories about, you know, transplanting pig hearts into humans, and I remember thinking very strongly at the time that I would refuse that. I wouldn't want that, or at least, you know, it's very easy to say that when you are not at death's door.
Right,
but
right.
my feeling was I would turn that down. Yet at the same time, I think that if I was on a desert island, you know, these desert islands that every non-vegan imagine we come into all the time, but the desert island where it's just me and the pig, I think I would kill the pig, or at least I think I would be justified in killing the pig. So yeah, I think that's a really great question. Pushing the necessity line when it comes to organs. Okay, so here's my final answer to that question.
All right.
There's a very nice paper by Nathan Nobis published in Between the Species that addresses exactly this point, where he puts the issue of xenotransplantation in conversation with the issue of subsistence hunting. So if I was going to give you an answer, I would start in conversation with Nathan's paper and see what he got right and see what he got wrong. But I don't know what that answer would be. So yeah, really fantastic question I'm going to think a lot more about.
All right. Thanks so much. I might email you about it in the future. See if you come up with anything, because it's also plaguing me now. But yeah, thanks you so much. It was fantastic having you. I'm sure everyone seemed to have a great time, and we got through all the questions, I believe. So yeah, thank you so much. And would you like to plug anything, or where can we find you?
Yeah, happy to. So thanks so much for having me. This has been absolutely great fun. So in terms of staying in touch with me, you're welcome to email me if you've got any comments or questions. I'm always happy to talk. If you want to follow me on the socials, I'm on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn. I'm on Instagram, which is a bit more fun, you know, well, fun to me, lots of pictures of vegetables and flowers, but at A Vegan Philosopher. What sense of vegan are you using? Yeah, good, we can argue about that. And then you can check out my website. I'm also on academia.edu. But most of all, I would encourage you to check out the podcasts I run, which is called Knowing Animals and features interviews with animal studies scholars about their recently published work. It's on Spotify, it's on iTunes, it's everywhere you can get your podcasts. In terms of my published work, you can find links to all of my papers on my website, including free-to-read versions of everything I've written, apart from my books, because, well, they're different in copyright terms. And if you are interested in my books, Just Fodder: The Ethics of Feeding Animals is out with McGill Queen's University Press now. The paperback version is actually quite affordable, but I do encourage you, if you've got access to a university library, to encourage your library to get a copy. Then you can read it for free, and so can other members of your institution. My other book is called Food Justice and Animals: Feeding the World Respectfully, and that will be out next year with Oxford University Press. The final draft has been submitted, but the book is not yet in production because academic publishing is very, very slow. But it's been fantastic talking to you all, and I hope my answers have been interesting, illuminating, or at least provocative.